Hi everybody, and welcome back to our discussion on Chapter 3, Absolute Body Size. So now that we've kind of talked about our assessment models and how we go through the assessment process, it's time to actually start assessing people. And looking at the absolute body size is our first step in this process. So the reason we assess body size is because of something called the principle of morphological optimization. So we know, just based off our previous two chapters of discussion, that successful athletes will be characterized by a mix of physiological, psychological, and anthropometric qualities. And these requirements are going to vary from sport to sport. So what it takes to be a very good football player is going to look different from what it takes to be a good gymnast, is going to look different from what it takes to be a good lacrosse player, a good swimmer. You kind of get the idea. And the reason this happens is because of this principle of morphological optimization. This basically means that there is a process ongoing in sport or activity that those sports or activities are going to apply selective pressures on the body. So body size and shape are going to start to matter if I want to perform well. There's a lot of variety of factors that can influence these selection pressures. So this can be genetics, this can be an individual's training status, it could be the supplements at the innocent side of things or performance-enhancing drugs on the more cynical side of things. It could be the space in which people play, it could be the rules, and it could also be advancements in equipment and gear. So there's a lot of different things that can kind of put pressures on what body sizes and shapes work well for different sports. Once this has come into play, morphological optimization is going to create a tendency that players within a sport or position are very homogeneous in their physique, so they all start to kind of look the same. And then it creates a heterogeneous physique between different sports. So this is when we start to look at people and say, you probably play this sport. So the example I offer up here is when we see a very tall, slender female. Typically, we start to think, oh, they play basketball or volleyball. Or if you see a very large, stocky male, the first question is to ask is, hey, what position do you play in football? This is morphological optimization at play. So, since we know this is occurring, the next question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we know whether absolute body size is important? So how do we know this is actually working? So to answer this question, we've assessed three different kind of subcategories of questions. First, are our athletes different from the source or general population? Is there a body size gradient across different performance levels? And are there any secular trends in body size? So let's break this down. So first question, are athletes different from the source or general population? The answer is yes. So depending on the advance of a sport, an athlete can be taller, shorter, stronger, bigger, any number of differences between the general population. So I pulled this image that you see on your left, and this is a comparison of professional athletes versus the average male. So an average American male is 5'9", and then we can see our various different average heights, weights, and BMIs of different positions. Then underneath we see the highs and the lows of these different professional positions. So we know that athletes are just generally different from the average person we pull off of the street. The next question is, are there body size gradients across performance levels? Again, the answer is yes. We tend to see the greater the level of the player, the more extreme a body characteristic becomes, and the lower the characteristic variability. So when we get to that really elite level, everybody starts to kind of look the same. I liked the quote in the book that says there's a physical difference between the best and the rest. So we know not only are athletes different, but when we start looking at levels of competition, the athletes are different there as well. And then the final question is, are there secular trends in body size? Again, the answer to this is yes. In an athletic population, we tend to see their body size changes outpacing the changes of the normal population. So right here, this is an evolution of the mass of Olympic shot putters over starting from about 1920 to 1990. And we can see here that on average, the Olympic shot putters are putting on 7.2 kilograms per decade, which is much more different than the average 1.2 per decade that the average population is putting on. So again, yes, we are seeing changes in body size trends. So, since we know body size matters, how do we actually quantify this importance? And this is where we start to get into some statistics again. What we do to kind of figure this out is we take our source or general population, and then we take our elite performer populations, and then we also take our sub-elite or elite populations of the past, and we kind of triangulate these groups, and we use some statistical analysis, and we identify things called overlap zones or OZs, or bivariate overlap zones or BOZs. Overlap zones is when we're only comparing one different trait. Bivariate overlap zones is when we're comparing two traits, and I'm going to show you a chart of this in a second. Basically, both our overlap zones and bivariate overlap zones, or OZ and BOZs, are going to work to calculate the probability that a randomly chosen individual from the source population would be a member of our sporting group. So this is what this looks like in practice. So this is data points for male athletes from 21 different sports. We can see here that we have our OZ and our BOZ. This first column right here is looking at stature. So how tall is this individual? So looking at this, we see these numbers under OZ, and we have the likelihood that this individual would be selected. So let's use boxing for an example. So right here, 11. So our OZ is 11. That means that there is an 11% chance that if I were to grab someone off the street, that they would be a member of our boxing population. Looking down the chart, there are some sports that are more likely. So for example, marathoners, right here, the likelihood of me grabbing a random person that could run a marathon off the street is a lot higher than, say, right underneath of it, participating in the NBA at only a 7% chance. So once we start combining variables, though, this is where things get interesting. Here, looking at the bivariate overlap zone, or the BOZ, we are looking at the mass and the height. So not only are you tall enough to do this, but now are you tall enough and strong enough to do this, or big enough to do this. So you notice, let's say boxing, when I was just looking at height, I had an 11% chance of grabbing somebody off the street that could box. But now when I take height and weight into consideration, there's only a 1% chance that I could grab somebody off the street that can box. So we can kind of see how these analyses can be helpful and kind of tell us how specialized body types and body sizes are to particular sports. So there's the same thing right here. This is looking at female athletes. So since you have this table, we just talked about the males, take a moment and kind of look through this and see if you can work through interpreting this data yourself. So now that we know that body size matters, let's talk about the physics of absolute body size. So the four biggest suggested reasons why body size matters to athletic performance and physical activity are inertia, fluid resistance, angular acceleration, and body surface area to mass ratio. I'm going to give you kind of a brief overview in this discussion, but this is something we're really going to dig through in the later part of the semester. So first concept is inertia. So by definition, inertia is the tendency of a body to maintain its state of motion. So if an object is at rest, it likes to stay at rest. If it is moving, it likes to try to stay moving. Inertia is going to be a big deal when we participate in anything that has contact, so body contact games like football. This means that having a state of rest or a state of motion is going to really impact the gameplay. We also know that inertia is going to be proportional to the mass of the body. So the larger the body size, the harder an opponent is to move. However, if I want that heavy individual to move, this means I now have to exert more energy and force to accelerate an object with great mass. So inertia can be a friend, or it cannot be a friend. The next concept is fluid resistance. So this is the resistance of a body moving through fluid. And when we think about fluid, we typically think of liquids, but fluid can also be a gas. So we deal with things like water resistance, air resistance. This is fluid resistance. Basically, we know that fluid resistance is going to be proportional to the body's projected frontal area which theoretically is proportioned to the body's surface area. So what you can see here on your right-hand side is we have a regression of aerodynamics. So any sports that require aerodynamics or moving through a fluid of some sort, this is where this is going to come into play. So this here we have some cyclists, and they have put their hands and handlebars in 3 different positions, one on the hoods, one on the drops, and one on the aero bars. So we can see here that the one with the aero bars actually is the best case scenario. And then we can see the other positions. So again, we're going to talk about this more in the biomechanics section. I just want to kind of introduce the concept to you. The next concept is angular acceleration. So if you have a sport that requires twisting, rotating, turning, rotation of any sort, angular acceleration is going to come into play. Angular acceleration works because it is going to rely on a torque or a force and the moment of inertia, which is a shape and characteristics of that mass. So when we're dealing with angular rotation, our rotational athletes tend to be shorter in stature in order to maximize this acceleration. We will get into this again a little bit more in this later in the semester. The final kind of physics concept that we are concerned with absolute body size is the body surface area to mass ratio. And this basically is an index of thermoregulatory ability. So your body size, can you absorb or let off heat efficiently? So we know our smaller body sizes are usually associated with a larger body surface area to mass ratio. That means the heat production should be proportional to the mass, and the heat loss should be proportional to the body surface area. Some things that can kind of confound this general piece of knowledge is any subcutaneous fat which is present, and this is going to act like an insulator. So individuals who have higher levels of body fat, especially under the skin, this is going to kind of mess up this general concept. So if we want high body surface area to mass ratios in sports where heat loss is going to be important, like working with a distance runner, this actually may be another additional reason why we see a selection pressure for smaller body size athletes in sports where heat loss is important. Also, our lever lengths can confound this ratio because it's a mechanical advantage for speed, but disadvantage for strength. So what does your sport need? Do they need you to regulate your temperature efficiently? Do they need you to be strong? Do they need you to be fast? Also, another thing that can kind of mess with these ratios is taller people tend to have higher centers of mass, which puts them at a disadvantage in sports that require stability, but you have an advantage in overhead projectile throwing. So all of these aspects are going to come together to build what is the best body type, body size for a sport. So now that we've kind of discussed this, let's dive into some trends we see with absolute body size. Kind of our source population for athletes is constantly changing and evolving, which means our trends in body size are going to do the same. This also means that our market for available sporting bodies is increasing. So over about the last 150 years, we've seen a substantial increase in the mass and stature of individuals on an average of about 1 centimeter and 1 kilogram per decade. That doesn't sound like much until you compare us, being 2020, to an individual that lived in like 1890. That's a big difference, right? The body size trend has also been accompanied by some earlier maturation and an increase in the world population. So we see that girls in the age of menarche, or their first menstrual cycle, is declining on average of 3 to 4 months per decade. And the starts of boys' voice is deepening. So kind of one of the first signs boys are going into puberty is declining at a rate of about 2 months per decade. So this means the average age of menarche for girls used to be somewhere between 14 and 15 years of age, and now it's somewhere around 11 to 13. That's a huge difference. Also, when we can combine our increasing body size, this early maturation, and our larger world population, that means we've greatly expanded our potential sports populations. So this will drive the development of more and more extreme sports-related physiques. This expansion can be good and bad. This expansion of more available people to kind of fill the void has created a shift in our power dynamics in sport. So this will help us actually diversify our centers of where sports powers come from. And it kind of gives opportunities for different racial and ethnic groups, individuals of different sexes and genders and age, an opportunity to participate. So these changes aren't necessarily bad. So looking at this now, we have a couple different patterns of optimization. We know that these patterns with the change of body size in the sports population have to be understood in relation to our general and source populations. There's 3 different ways we can assess this. So we have open-ended optimization. So this is what occurs when body size becomes more and more extreme in absolute terms. This is what like an NFL football player looks really different than someone in the general population. We also have relative optimization. So this occurs when the body size of a sport group may differ from that of the source population, but the changes fall in step over time. So, for example, your average person and a rugby player kind of look a little bit different, and these populations evolve over time, but they're tracking in step. And then finally, you have absolute optimization. So this occurs when the body size of the sport population does not change, despite secular changes in the size of our source population. A good example of this would be gymnastics. Gymnasts are always tiny, no matter the fact that women are getting larger over time and men are getting larger over time. So we have these 3 different levels of optimization. So remember a slide before when I said optimization isn't inherently a bad thing? Well, there can also be bad things. So some consequences of this kind of search for size. The good thing is we have opened up a globalized market demanding sporting bodies. This has shifted some power. But also when we have a globalized market, this means we're going to have a geographical shift in our sporting labor and capital. So how do athletes work? How do athletes live? How do we recruit and train people? This leaves a lot of gray area for some shady business. We also, due to this, have some more physique distortion, and we kind of have an exploding universe of sport bodies. So the bodies that actually get to participate in highly competitive sport are becoming more and more specialized. Because of this demand for these extreme sport bodies, we have also kind of created a demand to what my coach lovingly referred to as buying foreign in college. So this means that individuals will go out even for their national teams and will try to recruit foreign athletes, which, you know, recruiting foreign athletes, if you're in a country that has a lot of money and resources, can be amazing for those people that get recruited. But this creates a body drain from our poorer countries to wealthier countries. So we start to get an imbalance of power just based off of like overall country and system wealth. And then finally, as bodies become more extreme, so do sports salaries and winner-take-all markets. And now we have the possibility of teams poaching athletes from other teams. And we kind of start to lose the wonderful characteristics we see of sports, of sportsmanship, teamwork, things like that. And things start to become a business instead of playing for pleasure. So all of this is to say, body size matters. So how do I actually measure this? And we do this through a process called kinanthropometric assessment or anthropometric assessment. This is going to be essential, and this is how we quantify human morphology, and it's a fundamental aspect of assessment and monitoring. So whenever we are doing kinanthropometric assessment, we are going to look at an individual's body mass, their stature, their sitting height, skin folds, girth measurements, lengths and heights, and breadths of different parts of their body. Before you get started, though, on doing these kinanthropometric assessments, you need to actually know your anatomical planes and your body landmarks. So this is where your knowledge of anatomy comes in. So the 3 main planes I need you to be aware of are the sagittal plane, the coronal or frontal plane, and your transverse plane. Your sagittal plane is going to be a vertical plane that divides the body into left and right sides. There is also a specialized plane within the sagittal plane called the mid-sagittal plane or the median line. And this is going to divide the left and right halves of the body, and it's going to completely and equally divide the body in half. Your next plane is your coronal or frontal plane. This is also going to be a vertical plane, but now it's going to divide the body into front and back sections or anterior and posterior sections. Then finally, you have the transverse plane. This is going to be a horizontal plane that will divide the body into upper and lower portions, and these will run perpendicular to the sagittal and coronal planes. Next, I need you to kind of pay attention to some of your anatomical landmarks. If you go to page 38 in the Ackland textbook, it's going to have a very detailed description of each of these landmarks. I've just provided you with the pictures to kind of help you study this. When you start working through your Unit 1 practice problems, this will actually be one of your Flipgrid assignments where you go to hunt down some of these listed landmarks. Again, here are some other landmark sites for you to know. Again, go see page 38 in the Ackland textbook. And if you notice at the bottom it says, hint, hint, I would know these for a quiz, or your Unit 1 problems, or your upcoming test. All of those would be valid reasons to pay attention to these. All right. So, and then this leads us to kind of our final thing is, what equipment do I need for this? Get an anthropometric assessment's really cheap, so people tend to do it quite frequently. To get your length assessments, you need a stadiometer, anthropometer, segmometer, a measuring tape. It's pretty easy to get a length assessment. You're measuring from one anatomical landmark to the other. Your body mass assessments, typically you'll use a beam balance scale or a very high quality load cell scale. Typically, you want it to be somewhere between 0 and 150 kilograms. That'll get you to around 300 pounds. If you systematically work with larger individuals, like maybe you have a football team, you may want to get a bigger scale. But for the most part, getting up to about 300 pounds is normal. And you want this to have about 1/10 of a kilogram percent error. Your breadth assessments are also going to be an anthropometer, small sliding caliper, wide spreading caliper. Again, you can use just a plain old cloth measuring tape for this. Girth assessment is going to be an anthropometric tape. So this is going to go around different areas of the body. Your skin folds, you're going to want skin fold calipers. I would highly recommend, if you're going to do skin folds often, to get the nice metal research level grade calipers. If you get the plastic ones, the springs start to go, they break too easily. I don't recommend getting those. And then any optional equipment, you can get an anthropometric box that kind of helps you with getting everybody in these positions. If you want to get into more detail on each of these assessments, you can go to pages 41 through 46 in your Ackland textbook. So with that said, that is the end of chapter 3. We are flying, guys. I'm super excited to talk with you guys again for chapter 4. Bye.